My name is Zaid Azib Ansari. I worked on my PhD at Florida State University. I'm an author, a statistician, and above all, I'm a Muslim. My story begins really with a recognition of a Jet magazine when I was maybe 10 years old or so. I was riding my bicycle, and I was looking for a baseball game, a pickup baseball game. And I saw 3 or 4 young men on the baseball diamond. This was in the summer. And I thought it was baseball cards, the kind that used to come with the hard bubble gum with it. So as I approached on my bike, I was thinking, how can I swing a deal for a, Whitey Ford or Hank Aaron or Willie Mays? And I came to see that they were holding in their hands a Jet magazine. I thought it was a centerfold, again, of the Jet magazine. But no, they were looking at a picture of Emmett Till.
Mississippi. It was 1955. Things had begun to change for people of color in America since slavery times. However, African Americans knew that they were not in a position to force change too quickly. It was in this river that the body of 14-year-old Emmett Till was found after he had been brutally murdered by white men for an exchange of words with a white lady at a store where he went to purchase candy. Emmett Till was black, and being from Chicago was not fully aware of the dangers facing him in the racially charged South. The prosecuting attorney's final statement to the jury was, "I'm sure every one of you Anglo-Saxons will have the courage to free these men." In spite of several eyewitnesses testifying to the abduction of Emmett Till, the jury came back with a not guilty verdict after just 1 hour of deliberation.
His mother insisted that he have an open coffin, a glass coffin, so everybody could see this. And that picture still resonates in my mind of the brutality of that murder over a whistle, not a reported whistle. We don't even know if he whistled. But the oppression of the movement and the thoughts and the behavior of people of African descent in America was so dominant at that time that the people who perpetrated this crime were never brought to justice. And it was well known who were the actors in this crime. And that event really shaped the way that I look at the world, the way I look at things. And it introduced me in a very strange way of the value of being human. I started looking at life, really differently as a young boy, at 10 years old. And, I was so moved and touched by this event that when I rode away, there was a fence there on the ball diamond between the backstop and the exit. I was riding my bicycle through this narrow opening, and I cracked the mirror on my handlebar. And I looked in that cracked mirror at the boys still standing there, and it kind of, it struck me funny. It struck me as strange that, if you look at a cracked mirror, it shows you 2 images of things. One, the actual size, and one size is bigger than the actual size. And so those 2 events, seeing the slain picture of Emmett Till, and then looking back in that cracked mirror on my bicycle handlebar as I rode away, really characterizes my story. that the experience of moving through the different stages of my development and my mistakes, my trials, my tests, my accomplishments, I look at them as a part of that cracked mirror experience of looking at Emmett Till. And it was really the thing that kind of stirred my soul that led me to finally become a Muslim in that quest for justice and to make sense of the world, of why such a small act of a whistle would engender such hatred in a people to cause them to brutally murder a 10-year-old boy, 12-year-old boy. And so, you know, I really characterized several major turning points, major events in my life as a part of this cracked mirror experience. The Nation of Islam came on the campus, started holding meetings on Wednesday nights. Several hundred of us attended, listened to 3 or 4 weeks. After about a month, several of us joined the Nation of Islam. During that period, over the next 4 years, we were pretty much involved in the ideology of black nationalism and separation.
In the 1950s and 60s, African Americans were not allowed to drink from the same water fountains as white people, ride in the front of the bus, and were oppressed from multiple angles. Many African American youths were looking for ways to force change and became enamored with the Nation of Islam and other groups who were fighting for civil rights. Under the hot-burning sun, he declared... Malcolm X was a member of the Nation of Islam and spoke with the voice of millions of disenfranchised youth. He later accepted true mainstream Islam.
We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today. Because we weren't brought here to be made citizens today, now that we've become awakened to some degree and we begin to ask for those things which they say are supposedly for Americans, they look upon us with hostility and unfriendliness. If you're interested in freedom, you need some judo, you need some karate, you need all the things that will help you fight for freedom.
The theology of the Nation of Islam was I personally, as I look back, you know, I was pretty much, you know, forced myself to accept some of the things in the theology that I thought were ridiculous for the sake of what I thought was important, which was, you know, the nationalism and the self-independence. Long story short, I grew tired of that. Shortly before Elijah Muhammad passed away, I broke away from the Nation of Islam and began to really look for the authentic Islam in books and a few people that I could make contact with, because there was still this very militaristic regimentation in the nation, and one leaving the nation wasn't looked upon favorably. So there was some tension with myself and my very young family. I moved to another town not far from where I was living, and shortly thereafter, Elijah Muhammad died. And when Elijah Muhammad died, his son, Warithdin Muhammad, may Allah have mercy upon him, came in and changed the direction of the nation to gradual mainstream Islam. And so instead of fasting during December that Elijah Muhammad had, there was the fast during the Ramadan based upon the lunar sightings. And there was the introduction of the 2 Eid Salat for all the Muslims, and the chairs were removed from the masjid, and people learned how to pray, learned how to make wudu. I think the first group after Warif came into office went to Hajj in about 1977, 1978. And, you know, as I developed, the direction that I saw Warif community moving in became inconsistent with some of the things that I thought were important. You know, I returned to college, I started to study and independently think about, you know, what was authentic Islam, what was the intersection between Islam and my personal development and the crack mirror and the Emmett Till experience. And alhamdulillah, here I am today. My wife, Radia, is, she's a unique, beautiful sister. She's a treasure. She has stuck by me in our ups and downs. She's given me 4 wonderful children. She has, with babies on her knee, keeping her household, has pursued 2 degrees, bachelor's degree and a master's degree. She's become adept in building websites. She's a health educator and a childbirth educator, and she's the backbone of our family.
One of my fondest memories of Zaid is when he was challenged by Abu Khalil to start to translate things. He told him to do this to help him to build his vocabulary, and in his doing so, Zaid pulled out all the stops, got cards and made up cards, and oftentimes we would see cards all over the house. Don't touch my cards. I would see the dictionary, and he's gone through, I know, at least 3, and then I had one, and he wound up using mine, and then how I would, whenever I had to ride with him, I would see him, if we had to stop at a light, he would pull out the vocabulary cards, and that was significant because Zaid, he's like a walking dictionary, and very intellectual. So, and I got that early on because of his khutbahs, because at the time he was an imam, and by, you know, building up one's vocabulary, you know that you're going to use these words, and, you know, oftentimes some of the words that I recall him using or reviewing with, I would find them to be in his khutbahs. So this is why.
We need to strive to know the ruling of the Sharia on a particular incident. Why scholars had to put a lot of effort trying to figure out how to give the ruling on such topics and issues. Islam tells you to look good, to smell good. The reason of the recession was the collaboration between insurance companies and the banks. Some scholars, though, stated that it is permissible for you to insure because you're compelled to do this by the government, by law, but you're not allowed to benefit from the insurance policy.
You know, when I was in graduate school, I used to teach, and I had a job as well. And I had 2 of my older daughters. And I used to be just really stressed out. And cooking relaxed me. Mm-hmm. So I learned how to cook by just jumping in the kitchen. I downloaded an Islamic recipe book and went to work. and subsequently taught my family how to cook. So there's something that, you know, since I've been here in Egypt, that I had to refurbish my own skills.
Starting in the 1400s, approximately 14 million black Africans were captured in their own homeland.
Looking up at the sky, searching for...
Many of them were captured as far as 1,000 miles from the coast and were forced to walk the entire distance to awaiting slave ships in what was termed the Death March. These slave ships packed men and women like cargo to be sold in their new homeland of America. Many did not survive the journey to America and were subsequently thrown overboard, sometimes while still alive, as they were not deemed worthy of the food they ate.
that right will conquer wrong.
In America, they were sold as slaves, and all children who were born to slaves became slaves themselves.
The Muslim through the
Thus, those termed African Americans are in reality the descendants of slaves brought over from Africa.
So living as a Muslim means that you must play a part. Allah looks not
I had a professor, and she happened to be Jewish, and it was in a statistics class. And around the first week of class, she asked me, she looked at me and said, are you Ethiopian? And I said, not exactly. And I paused and said, not exactly. Because this reflex that people from the African diaspora have to say, no, I'm American, is a misunderstanding of personal biography and its intersection with history. So I wanted to make that clear in a real way for myself. And so I knew there was a large community of Muslims in Los Angeles, California, who had purchased property and who had gone to the Gambia in the late 1980s. And I had great affection for the Imam of this community, Imam Farid Abdullah, and I subsequently took my time and looked around, and around 1999, early 2000, I bought a plane ticket, flew from Atlanta to Paris, from Paris to Dakar, and from Dakar to Banjul. And my intent in going was, you know, not to be romantic about, you know, I'm home, but to buy property and to reestablish myself after being separated from my home for over 400 years. And, you know, people in America see German Americans do that, and they don't complain. They see Irish Americans do that, and they don't complain. They see Japanese Americans do that, and Korean Americans do that, and nobody ever raises an eyebrow. And a lot of Jewish Americans have dual citizenship. Nobody ever questions that twice. So it becomes a matter of novelty and great concern when someone from the African diaspora goes back to Africa and says, I'm home. Well, I wanted to break that pattern of novelty and surprise and reestablish myself back in an African country that's 97% Muslim, and reestablish myself among my people. The second thing I wanted to do is to establish evidence of this and not to rest on some kind of illusion of romance about being connected to Africa. So I went to the National Geographic's webpage, and they have a genome project where they are matching the DNA to its original origin for every human being on Earth that wants to do it. For males, the Y chromosome never changes. So I took a cotton swab of my saliva and I sent it to them. And within a few weeks, they sent me back a detailed report of exactly who I was in terms of my DNA and where my DNA was clustered. What ethnic group that DNA is clustered in. And I got three responses. They partitioned it in terms of its dominant types, in terms of the mathematical way that they process DNA. My earliest ancestors were from the highlands of either Ethiopia or Djibouti. So I had a very interesting story. I had been to Gambia several times, and I was leaving Gambia with some garments that I was going to sell when I got back to the masjid where I used to go in the States, because they were very nice garments, and the brothers had expressed that they liked them a lot. So, to help pay for my trip, I had a tailor make about 40 of these garments up, and I was taking them back. But I needed a big empty suitcase. And I went, and this was in a little Fula village, outside of the main capital. So I went in this little store, run by a very old man and his adult son. And when I went in the store, I asked for the bag, and I went in with a Fula from Guinea-Conakry. And the old man took one look at me. When I walked in the store, the old man took one look at me, turned his head, and walked away. So I asked the brother who was with me, what was that about? He said, okay, just be patient, I'll find out. So he went to the back of the store with the old man and his adult son, stayed for about 5 to 7 minutes, and he and the adult son came back laughing. And I said, so what's the problem with this older brother? What's the problem he has with me? He said, this old man believes that you are his brother's oldest son and went to England to study, and now you're too good to speak Fula. This is how much I look like these people. So we tried to convince him. هذا رجال أمريكي. He said, no, no, no. This is a Fula. I know him, I know this boy. I knew this boy when he grew up. This is my brother's son, I know this boy. And so there was nothing we could do to convince him that I was not his nephew. And that made a deep impact on me. And I use that as the pieces of evidence that when we say we're going to Africa to get back with our families and to put back together that which was broken, that's not romance, that's reality.